From Rishi Sunak's promise to stop the boats to another of his pledges, cutting the NHS patient backlog in England. In January, he promised lists will fall and people will get the care they need more quickly. But figures out today from NHS England showed the waiting list has in fact grown to 7.7 million. The Prime Minister has conceded his target would now be very hard to meet, pinning a large part of the blame on strike action. Our Health and Social Care Editor, Victoria MacDonald, joins us now. Victoria.
Yeah, well, as you heard, despite his pledge, that waiting list in England continues to climb, 7.7 million. Now, to be fair, that is not necessarily 7.7 million people. Some will be waiting for more than one procedure. Nevertheless, it is the list the Prime Minister was talking about, promising to get down, and it is that list that is now at an historic high. Now, what was interesting today was, as you said, he appeared to acknowledge he could miss this target, something he hasn't said before, and he did blame striking doctors. And of course, next week, both junior doctors and consultants are both on strike. On Wednesday, for the first time ever, striking at the same time. And it has to also be said, there is still no movement on talks or on any resolution. But think tanks, hospital chief executives, you name them, are not buying the idea that the strikes are to blame for the waiting list. Of course, they haven't helped, but there was a backlog that was there well before the strikes, and there are continuing serious staffing shortages. In fact, the Nuffield Trust think tank said today that their analysis shows that only a tiny fraction of those on the list would have started treatment even if the strikes weren't happening. And something else that hasn't received much attention but has today been raised by the Health and Social Care Select Committee. Now, they said that when the Secretary of State appears before them at the end of October, they will be particularly asking him about the children and young people who are waiting for paediatric care. Now, this list has grown by more than 6,000 since June to more than 420,000. And children not getting the care they need can have a long-term impact on them.
Thank you, Victoria. Well, I'm joined now by the Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation, Matthew Taylor. First of all, do you agree with the Prime Minister? Is he right that this strike action is a significant cause of the waiting list going up?
The strike action has had an impact, there's no question about that. So if you look at the statistics that have been published today, they're a kind of mixed bag. There has been some progress in, for example, lower ambulance response times. That's really important because one of the big risks in the health service is if ambulances aren't able to be dispatched on time. There's been a reduction in people waiting more than a year and a quarter for hospital treatment. And the numbers of people who've been waiting more than a year and a half, 2 years, that's quite low now. So those are good things, but the overall size of the waiting list reflects the underlying demand that we have in the health service.
Right. So if there hadn't have been strikes in hospitals in England, would Rishi Sunak have met his target of bringing waiting lists down?
I doubt it. But what we would have seen, I think, is more progress. I think the figures today would have been better. It looks like around 1 million appointments have been cancelled as a consequence of the strike. So that has a huge impact. And also, thinking of the fact that the government has committed £200 million to the health service today, we think the cost of those strikes is £1 billion. So it's dwarfed the extra money the government's been able to put in. So it has an impact, but it's not the reason we've got these long waiting lists.
But so the strikes are not helping, but that's kind of the point of them, right? And both sides are now so entrenched in their positions. Going into the winter, how on earth do we get out of it? What's going to change? What's going to give?
Well, it's really disappointing for people I represent, hospital leaders, to see these strikes becoming, as it were, business as usual. You know, they want to concentrate on meeting demand, reducing waiting lists. Instead, they have to think about rescheduling appointments, giving patients bad news that their appointment will be delayed. All we can do is what we've been doing for months, which is to call for the government and for the doctors' side to find some basis to begin conversations, to be pragmatic, to be creative. Let's remember, spring of this year, it felt like the nurses and the paramedics, we'd never had a breakthrough there, and we did get a breakthrough. We need to see some imagination because winter's going to be tough.
How tough, though? Because, I mean, on top of the consultants and the junior doctors in England striking next week, the first time ever, everything else you've outlined, the waiting list, the ambulance turnaround times, how bad do you think this winter could be?
Well, there's always uncertainties about winter. So we don't know, for example, about COVID and how bad that will be, other kind of respiratory infections. So there are unknowns. I think we're going into winter in a slightly better position than last year, certainly in terms of things like ambulance response times. It's a bit stronger than it was, but those underlying issues, over 100,000 vacancies, we've seen the story with RAC, the state of our hospitals, lack of equipment. So it's going to take years for the health service to get to the point where it can meet demand without being under huge strain.
Well, last winter was the worst ever, wasn't it? So slightly better than that is not great, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. No one expects winter to be easy. We hope it'll be a bit better than last year, but it's going to be very tough. These problems have built up, over years. We went in to COVID with 100,000 vacancies, with the crumbling estate. COVID hit us really hard. It will take years to fully recover.
You mentioned the 200 million the government's announced today to help the NHS in England get through winter. I mean, should this process have started sooner? Should you have started preparing? Should the government have started preparing sooner for the winter that's coming?
And to be fair to the government, this money has gone in earlier than last year. We criticised the government last year for how late this was. I think the real issue is that it's a very small amount of money when you look at the overall challenges that the health service faces. So, we, the Confederation, will be saying to the government ahead of the autumn statement, they need to put more money in if we're to have a reasonable chance of getting through this winter better than we did last one.
Matthew Taylor from the NHS Confederation, thank you very much for coming in.